Good morning, everyone. We're excited to talk about the direction of FX, but we wanted to start out with some questions. So a little bit of an engagement to kick us off. We'll do this by show of hand. So last time you sent funds across borders, do you know what the fees were? Did you know what more specifically, did you know what the fees were prior to confirming the transaction? Raise your hand if you knew what the fees were prior to sending a okay, so be 12 people. Raise your hand if you sent a transfer and you did not know what the fees were prior to sending. Okay, I'm in that group too. So about equal show of hands between the two groups. What do you think the average fees are for a $200 cross-border transfer in sub-Saharan Africa? What's the average fee? Would you say less than 3%? Raise your hand if you think it's less than 3 to 6%. Raise your hand if you think 3 to 6. 6 to 8%, 8% or higher. It's 8% or it's, I think it's 8.3, 8.4 as the last I checked. And what proportion of your country's GDP is made up of inbound remittances? Let's see how we ask this question. For those of you representing certain countries, is it less than 1%? You may not know, right? Less than 1%, 1 to 2%, 2 to 3, 3 or higher. Yeah, it really varies, of course. But last time we checked, I think, do you recall our exact numbers? I think Uganda, Nigeria, and a number of other countries that are of interest to this group here are, 3, 4% or higher, upwards of 9% in some instances. So foreign exchange inbound remittances are a really important aspect of their country's GDP. And the first two questions, we wanted to illustrate the fact that there are still problems to be solved for in cross-border. We can do this better than it's done today. At Glenbrook, we actually recently went through a process of sending a payment to Kenya that was continued on to Rwanda and ultimately came back to the US. And we through this transaction process, we itched at what were the fees incurred and what transparency did we have into that payment. And it was fascinating. Ultimately, I think we paid $400 for that round robin transaction, which was the transaction value was around $3,000. So proportionally pretty significant. We did not have exposure into some of the fee categories, how they broke down, who captured that fee amount, where the transaction routed. So again, all this to say, I think a number of us have experiences in the room that suggest we have a chance to do this better. And so one of the things we're working on in the community is to design for the how foreign exchange works in Mojaloop. So today we want to talk about how we're building for flexibility and for inclusion. We'll walk through sort of what cross-border models we can support, what approach to FX we can support, what use cases we can support, how do messages flow, and then for those of you who really want to dig into the details, I don't think we'll have a chance to cover this today, but we've done a lot of thinking around how pre-transaction liquidity takes place. I'll walk through the first two and then I'll hand it over to Michael. So there are a number of cross-border models for integration that are taking place for instant payment systems. These are 3 simplified models for what we're seeing in market. By no means does this capture sort of the nuances of integrations, but what we're seeing today is that integrations are happening in 3 simplified ways. We see a centralized approach to clearing where every institution connects to a regional platform to clear transactions. The static TSIB model is an example of this, as is what's taking place in Buna. We also see what we call a partially centralized model. It acts very similar to the centralized model, but instead of having a single platform for clearing, you have multiple designated platforms who have been approved to play that role. This is what we see in SEPA Instant. And the last model is what we call a decentralized linking model. And this is where individual DFSPs connect to their domestic instant payment systems, and those instant payment systems connect to one another to clear and settle, or to clear and settle. So just to say, these are three simplified worlds. We're also seeing expansions of this. Just as an example, we're seeing regional integrations connect into domestic integrations, right? So you almost see a domestic IPS decentrally connecting into what is a centralized cross-border model. So the world is sort of expanding in the integration approaches, the number of integrations we're seeing. I think what's relevant to this community is that from a foreign exchange perspective, we're designing to support any of these models. So we're not specifying any one model needs to be true in order for this solution to work. It can be applied to any of them. From our experience, I think any model can support inclusivity. So we don't want to preclude any model from coming to market if that's the right model for a certain integration experience. The second thing to mention is how the platform plays a role in facilitating foreign exchange. Again, from a very simplified perspective, foreign exchange can sort of happen in three places relative to the platform. One is the platform plays no role in foreign exchange or no role in conversion. The second is that the platform facilitates conversion by creating, say, a marketplace. And the third is that the platform provides the conversion services themselves, perhaps by designating a single foreign exchange provider as an example. We want to model a world where we can have foreign exchange providers compete and compete on price, ultimately to drive that price point as low as possible while still allowing a margin to be maintained by FX providers. And so the Mojaloop approach is to create a platform that can allow this marketplace model to exist, where a request for conversion comes in. Any FXP who's a part of the scheme is allowed to reply to that request. In that reply, they share the quote, and that quote allows the sending DFSP or the receiving DSP, and I'll let Michael speak to that in more detail, make the decision as to which company and which quote they want to move forward with. So ultimately, we want to allow for this competition to take place, and we want to facilitate that multiple quoting capability within the context of the platform. And so with that, let me hand it over to Michael, who can walk through some of the details around the messaging sequences.
Thanks very much, Cici. So buckle up. We're about to get a little bit technical, but hopefully not too much. And one thing I want to say is that if anybody isn't understanding the non-technical background to this, stick your hand up and ask, because this is technical responses to what we think are non-technical questions. And in particular, as Cici's already said, we want to foster competition in the provision of currency conversion services. We want that competition to include the ability for central banks to take part in the currency conversion process where that's appropriate for particular schemes. And we also want to make as sure as we possibly can that we drive down the cost of currency conversion as low as we can. So each currency conversion, in the way we've designed the system, results in the hub, the switch, receiving two kinds of messages. First set relates to the currency conversion itself, and the second set relates to the payment. Now, it's fundamentally important for the integrity, the financial integrity of the system, that these messages should be coupled together such that neither of them can succeed if the other fails. So we've got to make sure that it's impossible to have the currency conversion succeed if the payment itself fails, or vice versa. And that's one of the things that's behind our thinking. Now, in the case of conversion via a reference currency, there'll actually be three sets of messages. First, currency conversion, which is from the sending currency to the reference currency. Second currency conversion from the reference currency to the receiving currency. And finally, a set relating to the payment itself. And again, the payment will then be denominated in the reference currency. And again, we've got to ensure that either all of these transfers, or all these messages succeed, or none of them do. Now, the thing about this is that we wanted to support currency conversion being undertaken by the sending party or by the receiving party, or indeed to allow currency conversion by a reference currency, in which case they both do. And depending on which party is doing the conversion, which we allow parties to select themselves, though schemes can make rules that say, this is how you should do it in this scheme, messages will be received in different sequences. And each currency conversion will contain a determining transfer ID field. And that says the determining transfer ID field is the transaction ID of the payment itself. So we can tie multiple, if we want to, multiple currency conversions to a payment and say, these must all succeed or fail together. Now let's look at the sequence of messages. In different use cases. So if currency conversion is being requested by the debtor party, then you will get request to execute the currency conversion before you get a request to execute the payment. The debtor party says, please give me the funds that I need to make the payment, and then the payment itself is sent, and the payment itself is denominated in the reference currency. So the institution receiving the payment, which might be quite a small institution, doesn't need to worry about currency conversion at all. It just gets funds in the currency it expects to receive them. It's the sending institution in that case which performs the conversion, obtains the funds, which it then sends to the recipient institution. Oh, sorry. In the second case, where conversion is being requested by the creditor party, the currency conversion moves, because what happens then is the payment is denominated in the source currency. It arrives at the target, sorry, what am I trying to say? It's a creditor party. And the creditor party says, okay, now I'm going to do the conversion so I can credit the funds to my customer in the currency they use. So it gets the request to execute the payment, it performs the currency conversion, and when the currency conversion succeeds, it completes the payment. Finally, we've got the hybrid case where conversion is going through a reference or settlement currency, and that essentially is a mix of the first two cases. First currency conversion happens before the payment is sent, then the payment is received, second currency conversion happens, and then the payment is completed. So we've got different sequences between the different use cases. But what we can say is completion of the payment is always the last message in the sequence. That is the last message in the sequence. The receiving institution, the payee institution, completes the payment and sends back a confirmation to the switch saying everything is sorted out. Request and complete messages for currency conversion, in this case, always follow each other directly. There are no intermediate messages in those cases. Each payment or conversion execution request is stored, as we say, with the determining transfer's transaction ID attached. So each time a currency conversion request comes through, we can say, okay, I can see this is dependent on a particular payment succeeding, and this is the payment that we're talking about. This means, for instance, that we can also allow bulk purchases of currency where that's appropriate, because it's possible for a DFSP, if it wants to buy a large amount of a particular currency, and if it has the ledgers to support that, it can go to a foreign exchange provider and say, give me $500,000, well, sorry, give me 500,000 Malawian kwachas worth of Zambian kwachas. And it gets those in its ledgers, and then it can use them as collateral for the transfers that it's going to be making. If that's what the regulator requires, or if that's convenient for them, they can do that. And in that case, the currency conversion will not be tied to a particular payment. It's just a general one. Each completion message obviously needs to be checked for approval and signature integrity. So the currency conversion request will have the normal condition fulfillment items attached, so that the FXP in this case can confirm that it's being asked to execute a conversion on terms which it has already agreed, and reject it if that's not the case. And failure in that case should result in the cancellation of every part of the payment, i.e. all of the dependent conversions and the payment itself. Success is recorded against the actions record in the switch, so we always know which ones have succeeded and which ones haven't. And this allows us to build a set of related actions in which the last action will always be the successful completion of the determining transfer of the payment itself. Now, what happens when a currency conversion completes? When a currency conversion is approved, this is like saying, I'm going to allow the switch to decide whether this conversion actually happens or not. Now, in the case of a payment, as I'm sure you all know, when the payee institution receives the payment and approves it, that's equivalent to saying that's determining, and unless it's cancelled because of a timeout, whatever the payee institution says will be the final state of the payment. For currency conversion, that's not the case. The currency converter is in the same position as the debtor party. It's saying, I intend this to succeed, but you, Mr. Switch, must decide on my behalf, and I will accept whatever you decide. This is exactly, as I say, what the debtor party says when it requests execution of a payment. And the switch records the approval of the, that says payment, should say conversion, but takes no further action at that point. The action is pending until the determining transfer, the payment itself, completes. Now, the question we've got to answer now is, how do we assign these messages to accounts? The accounts are going to be the same whatever type of conversion is performed and whatever sequence the messages come in. There's always going to be a liquidity check and funds reservation against the debtor participant in the source currency and against the FXP, the foreign exchange provider, in the target currency, no matter who is doing the conversion. The following obligations, when the payment succeeds, are going to be an obligation between the debtor participant and the FXP in the source currency, and an obligation between the FXP and the creditor in the target currency. Again, those will be invariant no matter who's undertaking the conversion or what kind of conversion it is. So our task is to infer the correct accounts from the sequence of information received in the messages. This means for each message the switch receives, it needs to identify the message's position in the overall sequence of messages. If the switch receives a request to execute a currency conversion, then if the determining transfer has already been processed, we can go back to the picture I showed you earlier, then the switch knows that this is currency conversion by the creditor DFSP, and therefore the reservation needs to be against the FXP. Otherwise, it's currency conversion by the debtor DFSP, and the reservation is against the DFSP. If the switch receives a request to execute a payment, if it's already done, if it's already processed the associated currency conversion, then this is a payment where the debtor DFSP is doing it, and the reservation should be against the FXP. Otherwise, this is a payment where the creditor FXP is requesting the conversion, and the reservation is against the debtor participant. So this enables us to assign the reservations to the correct accounts, no matter what sequence we receive the messages in. When we assign obligations, first of all, when we get the transfer confirmed, we know we have all the information we need because the transfer confirmation is always the last message in the sequence. We can check that all of the currency conversions are complete, and if they're not complete, this is a catastrophic error and we cancel the payment. Then we go through the currency conversion reservations. If there's a reservation against the FXP, then there's a creditor conversion. If there's a reservation against the DFSP, there's a debtor conversion. And if we have both, then it's conversion via a reference currency. And that enables us simply to create the appropriate obligations in the correct accounts. I'm going to hand over now to Cici, unless there are any questions on that technical side of things. No? I'm looking at you, Miller. Sorry? Okay, yeah, sure. All right. In that case, the floor is yours.
Did you want to wait for your question or ask now?
Yeah. Thank you. Just a couple of observations on that. One is that your description implies that you're going to infer the transaction type. That is, I'm talking now about the FXP transaction because it is a transaction. It results in a transfer. You're going to infer that based on where the reservations sit within the switch. And while that's true, you could do that. I think you're in a much stronger position if you have a transaction type and actually submit that so that if it comes in out of order, you can just immediately reject the thing and say, you guys don't know what you're doing. Instead of inferring that it goes somewhere and saying, oh, wait, that wasn't what I meant. So I think you're in stronger place there. However, we've said as one of our invariants that the switch doesn't concern itself with transaction details. And so here we are. But I do think that for purposes of documentation and flows, it might make sense for there to be the two kinds of FXP transactions. One is the creditor size and the side, and the other is the debtor side. And it might be nuanced over time. It's going to end up with the same transfers you have. I see that. I think that might be something we want to process. It's more about language, I think, than the changing of the other. The second thing would be, you haven't said it, and it's probably for a good reason, that I don't have to buy the currency. I have to issue a contract for that. And so you can use derivatives. And that's up to the FXP, though, to ensure that a reservation that is a legally binding reservation can be made against funds that are on deposit with the settlement system. And so I don't know exactly how that works if they're buying 50,000 futures. You know, what's sitting on the balance sheet in the settlement system that doesn't pre-obligate everybody against something they don't really want to own? Is there any flexibility in that, or is this really good funds on deposit?
Well, I think my answer to the second question is the situation is exactly the same as it is for the guarantees for payments themselves. The scheme expects that participants' obligations will be in place before the transfer, or in this case, the conversion happens. It does not specify what kinds of assets those should be, what kinds of collateral that should be. So that is recorded for the foreign exchange provider in exactly the same way as it would be for any other participant in the scheme. And if they don't have that collateral, then they will not be allowed to do the transfer.
That, I guess, is my point, is to document that there has to be sufficient liquidity cover at the moment. There has to be sufficient liquidity cover at the moment that we are considering that step in the process, so that the invariant for Mojaloop is true, which is that that clearance is final upon clearance. So I should say the transaction is final upon clearance, and it is guaranteed to settle. That is, there's no, well, I thought I was good for it, or yeah, I had a contract, but I've chosen not to execute it. it's essentially out of the hands. And you said that using language which wasn't quite as explicit as I might have liked, where you said it's resigned to the switch. What we really mean is it is now the switch's decision to execute or not, and the funds will leave my account if the switch chooses that they do so. And we make it, we have a way of saying that, I think, around the simpler domestic transactions. We might use similar language for this to show these aren't different. This FXP transaction is not different than any other domestic currency transactions that we might be undertaking, but they have to be assembled together into this, what we were calling a transfer set, that must all succeed or all fail together. Anyway, that was just an observation, I think, on language and explanation, but it sounds like you've got it covered.
I think we're completely solid on that, but I'm prepared. I'm very happy to go through it with you to do that. I want to go back to your first point. First point. Sorry, I had an answer to your first point. What was your first point? Oh, 3 minutes left. We're almost there.
The description implies.
Oh, yes. Whether we should have an explicit statement in the message, what kind of transfer this was. We did look at that. And in fact, we do have a message as part of the, a field as part of the quote and approval field that says, I would like you to undertake, or I would like the creditor or the debtor to undertake the conversion. So that's in the transaction object, and it works fine, except where we're dealing with conversion via a reference currency. And in that case, we're expecting the reference currency conversion to happen outside the transaction object itself. And therefore, that we thought that that way of doing it, though it does exist, would not be sufficient to cover all of the use cases. Simeon tells me that we now have 3 minutes, now probably now 2 minutes left. So I'm going to hand over to Cici.
I'm just noting you had a question as well, so maybe we can chat after this. If it hasn't been made clear to the community already, I am not a technical person. So being involved in this work stream, the questions that come to my mind are often regulatory and scheme related. I think when I look at the design of how we're approaching FX, we're approaching it in a way that allows inclusive design and allows for flexibility. I think the latter means that there's a lot of questions that are going to result in really important scheme decisions and really important regulatory considerations. I think it's important that as a community, we capture what those are, we capture what the options are, we capture what the implications of each choice is, and we make those available to our schemes and to our implementers so that they can help guide, look, the technology can achieve X or Y. Here's what you need to do from a scheme perspective to move this forward. So this just is acknowledging some of the other aspects that we're thinking about as it relates to foreign exchange and currency conversion, and we will make our documentation available for feedback and for input. So I think our last slide is just to say what's next. You know, we're happy to be moving for this work stream. We've finalized and improved the API spec. I'm saying we. I think many of you had much more to do with that than I did. We have moved forward with developing the epics and the end-to-end stories. There are some folks who are moving some of those stories forward. There are other stories that need teams to be assigned and to implement those and to describe them in more detail. So we're seeking support. We're seeking implementers who want to get involved and help us improve this, move it forward, and bring it to life. So if you are interested, please let myself know, please let Michael know, please let Sam know, and we would love to speak with you further. Thank you. And any other questions? Oh.
Sorry, I just want to add one thing to that, which is to give kudos to Cici for creating a new verb to incent. Now, I will be using that, absolutely. Round of applause for Cici. And I will certainly be making sure to use the verb incent in every presentation I make from now on.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Cici.